Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Imaging Civil Rights, Photography in the Movement, a professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd just like to take a minute to introduce the National Humanities Center to you. We are located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. Our main program is a fellowship program that brings scholars to this country, from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write on topics in history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, topics like that. We are distinctive among institutes for advanced study in that we maintain a vigorous program of outreach to teachers of American history and literature. You folks have found our webinars, and to discover all the other resources we offer to teachers, please go to americainclass.org. Please take a look at our resources there. I think you'll find some really interesting things to use with your students. Now, when our seminar is over this evening, I hope you will go to the Imaging Civil Rights website. There you will find a recording of the program, a PowerPoint, and you will also find an evaluation. Please fill out that evaluation, send it back to us, and once we have it, we will send you a certificate of participation, which you will be able to submit to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this webinar warrants. Now, how do you participate? Well, our scholar this evening, Sara, will be talking about photography and the civil rights movement. From time to time, we'll be stopping to ask questions. We hope to respond to those questions by putting your cursor in that green box that I bracketed there, typing your answer, and hitting that send button to the right. Your message will appear in the large chat box above, and I will bring it into the conversation at appropriate moments. But don't wait for us to ask a question. Please participate at will. If you have a question, or if you want to make a comment on your own, if you see material in the program that you think would be useful for your students, please share that with us. Remember, the more you participate in these seminars, the better they are. So let's get underway. We are very pleased to have with us this evening as our seminar leader, Sara Blair, professor of English at the University of Michigan. Sara's primary interests are late 19th and early 20th century American culture, photography and visual culture, modernism, and modernity. In 2007, she published Harlem Crossroads, I'll get that right, Harlem Crossroads, Black Writers and the Photograph in the 20th Century. And with Eric Rosenberg in 2012, she co-authored Trauma and Documentary Photography of the U.S. of the FSA. Let me unmute Sara's microphone and turn the program over to her. Sara, how can we read photographs of the civil rights movement? The program is all yours.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thanks to all of you for joining in. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to an evening of questions and conversations and lots of discussion. To start with, I wanted to suggest some of the guiding questions for this seminar, and you'll see them up on your screen here. I want to begin by asking overall how images, photographs of the civil rights movement have shaped its impact and its legacy. How were photographs of the movement made, and what were their aims? And I think a really important question in terms of teaching in particular, how do these photographs open up new understandings of citizenship, of shared values, of what it means to belong to America? The largest goal of the seminar is to model amongst ourselves and for your students how we can engage critically with photographs and use them as learning tools. Photographs have an extraordinary power to bring the past to life and to help us understand how complex social actions and feelings have taken shape. So a real goal for us here will be to think about that use of photographs and to spend time really working with images on the ground. Along those lines, I wanted to offer some guidelines. Some of you may be very familiar with image study. Some of you may be very experienced teachers of images, but I think it's really helpful to have some general shared understandings of what it's like to look at photographs together in a teaching and learning context. So first we begin just by asking what is visible to us, what we can say about the event or the action that the photograph records simply from what we can see. That makes photographs a wonderful teaching tool for students who may not have a lot of background or expertise, just beginning with what we can see in front of us. Also important, I think, to consider why we think the photographer included the particular elements we can see, and also to ask what's not in the picture, what on further reflection might be missing or not available to us. Without using a lot of very technical terms, we can start to ask how people or objects live in the frame that we've been given. What's in focus in the image or not in focus? Where does your eye go as you look at the photograph? Another thing I like to do with students is to ask about the photograph as it's taken out of its context, the kind of living, moving history that the event it pictures was part of. What might have happened just before? What might have happened just after? What kind of moment are we looking at? And then vantage point and perspective, which are so filled with symbolic and cultural value. What does it mean that we're looking at an image or an event or a person from a particular vantage point? How might we think about that or comment on it? So those are some of the larger, some of the questions that will help us accomplish the larger aim. I did want to begin by offering just a very brief timeline of the civil rights movement. I think it's useful for our purposes in part, and I noticed that most of these events will be familiar to most of you probably. We have them on 2 slides, so I'll just click through those. I just wanted to point out that this very brief and very partial timeline helps us think about a powerful intersection between photography and the struggle for civil rights. This key period between the mid-1950s and the mid-1960s, if we look at just kind of major headline events, we see that there's an extraordinary swiftness with which events happen. And in part, that swiftness, that momentum, that movement of the movement is really aided by photography and photographic culture. As we'll see, as we begin looking at images in just a moment, photography, making images, staging activity and political demonstrations and actions for the camera became really critical to the pursuit of civil rights and its strategies and its ways of working. So along those lines, I actually want to identify an origin for the civil rights movement in a single image. And the image I'm about to show, or the sequence of images, is definitely not untroubling. I just want to mark that here. This is a page spread from Jet magazine from September 15th, 1955. This was one of the largest circulation magazines throughout Black America in the 1950s. And as you can see, the feature story here concerns the murder, the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. Emmett Till was, of course, a 14-year-old teenage boy from Chicago who'd been visiting relatives in rural Mississippi, who was accosted by a group of white supremacists, white onlookers, and beaten, tortured, and shot. His mother made the decision to have an open casket at Till's funeral and to allow photographers to make photographs, which was really a kind of unprecedented event. And the publication of these photographs, first in Jet and then throughout the United States, these were taken up by wire services, published all over the country. That marks a really critical moment in the pursuit of civil rights and in the intersection of civil rights and photography. Photographers and others began to understand how making visible the realities of racial violence, of desegregation, how confronting Americans, white Americans, Americans more broadly, with the real effects of this history could be critical to changing hearts and minds. But images, violent images, or images of racial violence weren't the only sort of origins or impetus for what we think of as civil rights images. And I wanted to pause for just a moment on this very, very famous photograph made by the art photographer Robert Frank. Now, Frank himself was not American. He was not in any obvious way part of the civil rights movement. He, throughout 1955, traveled all across the United States making images of America for a project called The Americans. And the publication of that book was kind of revelatory for art photographers in the sense that it made these very powerful, visually beautiful, often very quiet studies of the differences, the inequalities, the legacies of racial history in the United States, key to the work of seeing America. I wanted to pause for just a second here and ask how we might understand this as a civil rights image, maybe using some of the questions that I've invoked. How are we being encouraged to see what's in the frame of this photograph? And how might we think of this as a photograph that speaks to the vision, the problem of race in America?
Okay, we have some participants typing. Bring their answers in. Consider the horizon. Yes, they're really well. You've got a horizon there in the reflection in the windows above the main windows. Multiple separations with the vertical lines. Yep. Got some other folks typing in. It is clear that the black passenger at the back of the train, whites are in the front, African Americans in the back. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is a streetcar in New Orleans, and maybe a subtle reference to Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams. It's unclear whether that's part of the work that Frank is doing, but that very clear sense of segregation and separation, the bars of the windows, almost like cells or physical barriers to some sort of community.
We have an interesting comment about the children. Children are centered, possible targets for the future. The window frames each person as their own entity. There are no challenges. Not quite sure what Judith means by that. Yeah, and I like what struck me is the facial expressions of the white woman there on the left and the African American man on the right. I mean, we've got in him we have this kind of kind of forlorn, yearning look, and that white woman has a very hard, stern look, and they're both looking at the cameraman.
Indeed. So if nothing else, this image by an outsider to America of everyday American life really confronts us with what segregation looks and feels like.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in any again, self-evident sense a civil rights image, but I think what Frank is proposing is that to see America in the mid-1950s is inevitably to be forced to confront, whether we're talking about the US South or the North or the West, the rural or the urban, at some level we're being forced to confront the power and the kind of ubiquity of segregation and racial inequality and their impact.
Mm-hmm. We have some other comments. Question of the photo is what the children will decide to do in the future. Will they be apathetic or see the error of the elder generation? Pat Marshall notes that the photograph is ironic too. On public transportation, one would expect movement. That's right. Well, obviously, this is a still photo, so you're going to get movement, but there is this static quality to it. And the young boy seems already to have adopted a defiant stance. What strikes me about this, we're going to see photographs that are definitely civil rights photographs later on in this presentation, but for those, you wouldn't know they were civil rights photographs unless you understood the context and saw the title. This one is shot in New Orleans, but you could take that title away. This could be virtually any city in America, as you said, in 1955. So this, I think, even without the context, this stands, I think, as a civil rights photo.
I think that's a great observation, and it suggests that what makes or counts as a civil rights photo may not be the deliberate attempt to record a specific event so much as a commitment to trying to make visible what the realities of social life in America at this moment are like. And that's, I think, a very useful observation. Some of the images we're going to see are journalistic, that is to say they were made on journalistic assignment. Some are considered art photographs. but the line between those really blurs as photographers come more and more to be invested in this project of seeing America and making visible what these realities are actually like on the ground in experience and in everyday history. So along those lines, because we focused, I think the participants were so great in focusing on the young people in Robert Frank's photo, I want to turn to this. I think this is a great place to open up that discussion about youth and the future. It is actually the case historically that one of the first and most important battlegrounds for civil rights activity, for the resistance to inequality and racial segregation, actually happened in schools and classrooms with the Brown v. Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court in 1956, which did away with separate but equal facilities in public education. This meant that there was a wave of activity to desegregate or try to desegregate classrooms, mostly in the US South. And as a result, there was a wave of resistance to that desegregation. This photograph by a photographer named Will Counts was made in Little Rock. It, I suppose, could have been made in other places, talking about context. That Little Rock was Little Rock Central High School, formerly all white, was famously one of the first institutions to undergo desegregation, and met with such violence that the National Guard had to be called in, and this became a kind of epic event in broader American history. So before I say anything about the photographer or the context here, I wanted to ask our participants who already seem to be typing lots of things, how they would read this as a civil rights photograph. Where do they feel our eye, our imagination, our energies are meant to go?
Hey, while some more folks are typing in, Bill Braychak, and I hope I pronounced Bill, I hope I pronounced your last name properly, notes that this is a very famous photo. A hostile woman is said to have followed the students to the bus stop. Another participant asks, do you feel these photos would be responded to differently if they were photographed in color as opposed to black and white? That's a really good question. If we could get to that, Sarah. Pat Marshall writes, my students always make note of the sunglasses on the figure at the center and the lack of camouflage on the folks surrounding her, almost as if they want to be sure she sees their emotion and she wants to be sure that they don't see anything that they might be provoking in her. Really good point.
These are great questions.
Yes, center of the photo is the center of the photo with the student being yelled at by the mother. Woman to the student's left, our right, follow the students to support and protect her. Oh, the woman who's carrying what looks like a black purse. I didn't know that. Brent Tomberlin writes, eyes are on Elizabeth Eckford and the woman in white yelling behind her. I'm coming in late. Did we look at them until wasn't included? Yes, Brent, they were at the very beginning. We are meant to respond to the tension in the photo. Yes, that is true. My eyes go to the young black woman who projects calm in the storm of hatred. We have a few more coming in.
Fantastic comments. Yeah.
But how would you respond to those, Sarah? And if you want to, at this point, I know this is a large question, but if you'd like to, could you respond to the fact that these are in black and white? I don't think we have a color. Do we have a color photograph in this at all?
We do, and I'll make sure that we get to it at some point. Okay. So right. let me address that one first. I think that's a marvelous question. The resonances, the social, the political resonances of black and white as the medium of visualization here are really profound. Now, many photographers of this era shot in black and white because they could, the technical processes involved in working with black and white film, in getting it into production very quickly, the fact that in this era, sort of golden era of photojournalism, images were bouncing back and forth between news magazines, which typically did use glossy paper stock and color, and newspapers, which of course typically use black and white, meant that many photographers chose to work in black and white at least much of the time. Now, some photographers actually understood that exploiting the inherent sort of tension or opposition or contrast of black and white literally as colors could speak to this kind of subject matter. And, image by image, that's a real question as to what use the photographer is making of that opposition. I think
Mhm.
here, that's a great question. Elizabeth Eckford, as one of the participants mentioned, the young woman out in front here, really looking like she's kind of all on her own. She was one of the Little Rock Nine, and it's just an irony of circumstance that the other 8 students were all supposed to arrive with her. They were supposed to enter the high school together. That was the plan. But she arrived early, and she began this incredibly lonely journey through this sea of mostly hostile people with federal troops lined up behind. And Eckford herself later wrote, she was a very shy person, that she put the sunglasses on so that it would help her focus basically on just putting one foot in front of the other, so that she really could try to screen out some of what she knew would be these very hostile and challenging responses. We have so many questions here. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, we have two.
A
We have
lot
two
of them
interest. We
focus on
have
the
two interesting.
sunglasses.
Right. We have two interesting comments. One going back to your earlier discussion about how to read a photograph, talking about focus. One of our participants has noted that Elizabeth Eckford is slightly out of focus, but the crowd, particularly the screaming white woman directly behind her, is in sharp focus. I think a very insightful comment on the way the photographer shot this. And then also I have a comment here. Andrea Owens wrote that color was still very difficult to put into newsprint. It was unstable. And, come to think of it, I can remember back at this time, and when you did get a color photograph in a newspaper, it always looked as if it was kind of shaky. It wasn't stable. It wasn't a clear image. So maybe that technological issue also helps to answer the question, why black and white?
No, absolutely. That's absolutely right. The production process, the printing processes for color were far less well developed than they would very shortly become. But one of the participants also makes another important point. The reading materials I offered to participants in advance were meant to suggest a very clear connection between civil rights imaging or socially conscious photography of this moment and the earlier conscious photography of the FSA, of the New Deal
Mm-hmm.
era. The vast archive of images of Americans struggling under the Depression. Black and white is still considered serious. It indicates a
Right.
kind of seriousness of purpose, and it links these photographs with a tradition both of art photography and of documentary photography that is really intended to help change the world, to help address inequalities, to make wrongs right. And I
Mm-hmm.
think all of those different meanings of black and white, the history of its uses are being mobilized in an image like this one. The question of focus, I think, is really critical. The participant who observed that, the screaming white woman right there at the center, literally the focus here is not on Elizabeth Eckford. This photograph, we could say, is really about the violence, the tension, the kind of ugly feelings that are required to sustain segregation. Um, it, of course, shows us the dignity and the grace and the calm of this extraordinary young African American woman. But the real story, I think, is in the responses of the other students and the white people behind her.
Mm-hmm. One of our participants earlier mentioned the tension in the photograph, and Lisa Cater, and again, I hope I pronounced your last name properly, Lisa, notes one of the important elements in that tension. She writes, "It's ironic that the women in the mob took the time to look so prim and proper." Everybody in this photograph, the women are dressed very nicely. You would not, everybody's dressed respectably. You would not expect that kind of violence from these kind of respectable people. So that shows, who was responsible for this kind of violence in the South. It wasn't necessarily outcasts and people on the edges of society. These are people right at the center of society. These are respectable folks.
Absolutely. And one thing that often brings this image home when I use it with my own students, this is also a back to school photograph. This is an
Mm-hmm.
image of a young woman coming to this high school for the first time on the first day of school, on the opening day of school. And the woman screaming behind her is actually another student in the high school. So these are parents and children who are part of the same school community. I think that's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, you can see the woman up to Elizabeth Eckford's left is carrying school books herself. So pretty clearly she's a student. The screaming woman, yes, it's kind of hard to tell that she's a student. One of the things that strikes me is that these three women are high school students, and yet they look so older and mature. I mean, high school students today, I don't think look that old.
Well, that is an interesting, perhaps there's a historical distinction there to be made with our own students. But I wanted to address the comments that a number of participants were making, sort of about the focus and the composition of the photograph, without spending far too much time on this one. This really is an iconic image. One question to ask the participants is how they think the photographer got this close. He's not actually shooting with a telephoto lens. So he is remarkably close to the people whose images he's making here, the subjects of the photograph, all of them. And it really is kind of extraordinary that he got this frontal shot from what is not a very far distance.
Mm-hmm. How do we think he got that? And while we're waiting for a response to that, Andrea Owens notes that violence and overt racism were the acceptable norm then, which helps to explain the respectable people who were shouting and tormenting Elizabeth Eckford. Here's a good question. Do you think the people were aware that the event was being recorded in the media?
That is a great question.
Yeah.
And I have to say that the photographer, this is a moment to really think a little bit about this photographer, Will Counts. I think it's very important that Counts himself was a local. He was born in Little Rock to a family of sharecroppers. That is to say, white folks who might have had a place somewhere in this group, on the way to being a mob group of people. He himself was a graduate of Central High School. And in fact, he learned to use a camera in a journalism class he took in this very building. And he later wrote that he was so concerned about being able to make images of what he knew would be this historic event in his own hometown that he actually, he dressed up like a farmer. He wore sort of a plaid shirt, overalls. He said that he was determined not to look like a journalist or like someone from back east. And I think that exploitation of his own relationship to this place, to these people, to this institution is very much part of what allowed him to make an image that looks the way it does.
Right. Okay, we've got about an hour, and I think we should probably move on, although I think we could spend all night on this topic, on this photo.
We could indeed. So while we're thinking about insiders and outsiders, and I wanted maybe to start a strain of conversation about how complicated the relationship of photographers to the images, the events they were photographing turns out to be. And it would be helpful here to look at the work of, I think, the photographer who may in fact be the most storied photographer of the civil rights era, a man named Charles Moore. Moore himself was, like Will Counts, a Southerner. He was a native Alabaman and the son of a Baptist minister who denounced segregation throughout his career. Moore's father preached in black churches. Moore himself had had a career as a boxer and later wrote that he wanted to continue his father's fight, not with his fists, but with a camera. Moore was right on the scene in his native Alabama for many of the most nationally riveting, the most horrifying, the most epic events of the civil rights, kind of unfolding civil rights movement and civil rights protests. And I thought it might be useful, actually, I'll just show you very quickly. He actually began his career at the very moment when Martin Luther King, taking leadership role in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, began his career of civil rights activism, of arrests, of protests, of marches and sit-ins and so on. And Moore very quickly developed a sense of how civil rights actions and violence, racial violence, were unfolding in these spaces and kind of places around him. So I want to pause on this image for just a moment, made in Montgomery, Alabama in 1960, which is relatively early in the life of the movement, and ask for viewers' responses to how Moore has captured this moment of exchange, this unplanned moment of exchange. Are we there? Have I lost you? Richard? Richard, are you there? Okay, I can't hear you, but goodness, that's strange. I've just suddenly lost audio. So I can start comments. I'm loath to just keep talking, but it sounds like we've all lost Richard. So maybe I can just say a few words. I want to be sure that we can continue here. I see a number of you have noticed that this photograph right from center in front of us is a man about to swing a baseball bat. Toward the center, at the rear of the image, we can see a man who's raising his fists. So these two African-American women at the center of the image are just about to be assaulted, and that is the moment that we're watching. If we had audio, I'd want to raise the question of how the photographer's framing of this image contributes to our sense of violence and of what we're being asked to confront. And I'm going to see if we can get Richard back. So I'm seeing a few of you typing comments here. Let me see if I can try to field some of those. A couple of you have noticed the image. This really is a kind of cockeyed angle. It reminds us maybe of film noir, of art photography and experiments in unusual framing that alienates us from the action. And I think in that way, Moore has very much put us in the in the thick of things. We're a little bit confused. We have to adjust our perception. As Pat Marshall says, the image is askew, like the situation it depicts. I think that's exactly right. Another thing I'd ask participants to notice, someone has noticed that a man standing to the left of the image appears to be holding the sleeve of a man next to him. The postures of the onlookers. Some are staring directly at the action. Some seem to be gazing off into the distance. There's a variety of responses and non-responses here. Bill Braychek, I hope that's a correct pronunciation, has raised the question of why are the bystanders merely looking on? I think that's a really important question, because if we notice where Moore has positioned the camera, this group of onlookers, mainly white, not all, forms almost a kind of circle around the two women who are being assaulted. And the camera, and along with the camera, we as viewers really kind of complete that circle. We're standing at the edge of it. And I think the dynamic of the image and the intensification of the feeling and the multiple gazes and the way onlookers are responding and not responding really forces us to confront our role in this event as we encounter it. What are we doing? Are we merely looking on? Are we called to action? Is there something we could do to stop, to intervene, to create some sort of transformation or change. I think this is an image that really calls us to belong, to make sense of what it means to belong here. It's very difficult, and Moore has made it very difficult to be a passive onlooker. So Pat Marshall writes, if we're observers, we've been made to feel either participatory or impotent. And I'd like to think that, given the body of Moore's work, that he's suggesting that we're not just impotent, that we might actually, as a result of this encounter with this image, we might be moved. We might become part of a movement toward something that is not this kind of violence, something that is a more constructive kind of change. I'm going to wait just a second because, again, I can't hear anything, but I see that a lot of people are typing.
All right,
Richard, are you back?
Can you? I hope so. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Oh, good. I don't know what happened. Phase of the moon or something. Anyway, good. I'm glad to be back. You were carrying on beautifully. I felt I should just sit here and listen and learn. Okay.
That's kind of quite all right. That's quite all right. I just want to see if anyone has any other questions about this image. Otherwise, I'll just make another observation or two and we can move on. I like Brent Tomberlin's comment very much. It's decision time. Which side are you on? And I really think Moore is, quite extraordinarily, he didn't create this moment. He found it, but he found it with his camera in such a way that it really forces us to confront that question. And I do think that sign on the left edge of the image, which we know, we can't see it all, but we know it says one way. So where is this moving? Where are we going? Where is all this going to end up? And I should say, just quickly in response to a question that one of the participants asked, this photo, like all of Moore's work, Moore had a huge audience for his work because he was actually, at the time he was doing these photographs, employed by Life magazine, which in the late 1950s and early 1960s was the single most widely circulating photojournalistic organ in the United States. So these images were seen by millions and millions and millions of viewers.
Sarah, if I could just ask.
Oh yeah.
I realize we can't spend a lot of time, but if we could go back to that photo, I could just ask one quick question.
Sure.
This is journalistic photography, it's documentary photography, but it's also street photography. Charles Moore was at the right place and he pushed the shutter at the right time. How much of this is luck?
That is a really good question. Partly I want to say anyone who's ever worked in photojournalism or on photojournalism knows that there's a fair amount of luck involved, but there's also an extraordinary amount of skill involved, understanding what the action unfolding around you will look like when it's framed in your lens, by your camera lens. There's also, I would argue, for Moore and the other photographers that we'll be thinking about tonight, their work is lasting. It continues to mean something. I think because what they brought to this set of projects, to these photographs, was a deep commitment to seeing America as it was at its worst and as it might be at its best. And I think that commitment, takes a great deal of talent to enact that commitment in photographs that are meaningful in this way. But I think that commitment really drives the most enduring and most powerful images of this era that we have.
And one more
that's
comment.
How I'd answer.
A very good answer. One more comment before we move on. Andrea Owens notes that the root signs are pretty interesting. Could they be seen on a symbolic level? How about that, Sarah?
Absolutely. I think that's a great reading. And I encourage participants to go there, in your own viewing and also with students. So those root signs are there. The photographer, this is long before Photoshop. The photographer, if he's just picking up his camera and snapping this moment, they're going to be there. But we could argue that the way he's organized his look, his view, his perspective allows us to see that there might be symbolic meaning there. Again, this is a crossroads. Where will this go forward? Where can we move from here? And I think that meaning is really available. I think the photograph lends itself to being read that way. That's a great comment.
Well, moving from here, we should move on.
I I do want to move on to another image of Charles Moore's, and I'm wondering if a number of participants have actually seen this image before. This is one of the most iconic images of the entire civil rights era, made in Birmingham in 1963. I'm not going to say a word about this at first. I'm just going to ask, this feels very different than the photograph we just looked at of the sort of street violence. And I want to ask, same photographer, I want to ask our participants why they think Charles Moore in this case chooses to frame the image as he does. Again, he doesn't stage this. He is on the street with peaceful protesters, and he turns his camera on actions that are happening whether he's there or not, but he does choose to see this action in this way. So I just want to throw that question open. Why do we think Moore takes this perspective and frames this moment in this way?
Okay, in the meantime, Brent Tomberlin writes about this photograph. It illustrates that there's no way to go in this one. Laura writes, this image hurts me just looking at it. The pain inflicted by the water is intense. It is an image of helplessness. Andrea writes, luck, oh, we're going back to our early question, luck, genius, professional instincts, smart to know what you have been. Yeah, you're there, timing, guts, awareness, basically the some of the same elements you talked about, Sarah. The fire hoses took the bark off trees, and there is truly no place to go. I think this perspective is interesting as the water comes from off camera, where the viewer cannot see the source. Important insight.
I like that comment. I think that's really important. So unlike other images that Moore himself made and images that we've all seen, certainly, that were also very widely circulated, very powerful, this is not an image that exposes the police or firefighters as the perpetrators of this violence. This is not an image that in a journalistic way identifies the forces of state authority, law and order, discipline that are perpetrating this act. This really focuses on these three young people, very young people. And the fact that we can't see who's holding that fire hose, I think opens up the symbolic suggestion that the force that is required to keep these people down, to press them up against that wall, it's not just about the police or the firefighters or Bull Connor or the city government of Birmingham, Alabama. It is the full weight of a collective history in the United States for which all of us are responsible. I think that leaving, cropping or framing the image so that we don't actually see the literal perpetrator here really opens up that suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the force of that water. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I noticed that one of the participants noticed these are kids. Yes, very young. This was part of an orchestrated campaign designed by Martin Luther King and others called the Children's March, in which very young people, children and school-age students, were sent to lead marches in cities in Alabama, in Birmingham in particular, and were attacked in exactly the same ways that adult peaceful protesters were attacked. So all the more violent, all the more disturbing for that reason.
Okay, shall we move on?
Yes, we will. We do not, unfortunately, have time to linger over other of Moore images. I've included them. Again, an iconic image of police dogs, very different from the fire hose, a very eerie image of the standoff on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965. The police, of course, geared up for the tear gas, the protesters not so much. But that the work of and the extraordinary work of Charles Moore and the way in which he embedded himself in civil rights activity leads me to turn to a very, very different photographer, Danny Lyon. A big part of the effect of civil rights imaging, one could argue, especially over time, had to do with the fact that the photographers themselves were embedded in increasingly various ways in the activities of protest and resistance and the movement more broadly. And Danny Lyon is really a case in point. I threw in this self-portrait of him in 1960. He is as young as all those other protesters and movement figures we've been looking at. He really became a photographer while he was at the University of Chicago because he was committed to the civil rights movement. So he was not a professional photojournalist who then was assigned to or chose to cover the movement. It was sort of the other way around. And Lyon's work from within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he became their first official photographer, really opened up a whole new way of seeing the struggle for civil rights, locating it as a kind of utopian sort of project of young, future-oriented, inspired people, not people who'd necessarily been victimized or who'd suffered under older racial regimes of segregation and the sort of inherited cultures of the South and of other places in the US for that matter. So Lyon began his work almost by making what we could think of as a kind of family album. They're not quite selfies, they're very composed and they're very beautiful pictures, but he documented the work of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other student movement groups. And he really focused on the world that these students were creating as they worked on the Civil Rights Project. And I think this was really important because it showed young people marching and protesting and resisting and so on, but it also showed them really living and working and thinking and imagining together, Black and white, men and women from all parts of the United States. These, in this respect, these were images that most Americans had really not seen before. And I think it's important to count these as civil rights images. They don't show fire hoses or police dogs or police brutality or any of the subjects that I think we've latterly come to associate with what it means to know something about the history of civil rights. This is a very different view. The beauty here and the dignity and the real sense of a purpose in common that these young people share. Now, that said, those were not the only images that Danny Lyon made. And one of the things I think he was really quite brilliant at understanding as a photographer from within the movement is that some of the most important work to be done by civil rights photography, by the movement itself, by photography as a project, is directed at white Americans, at everyday Americans who vote and the public leaders and figures who are supported by them. So Lyon spends a fair amount of time actually making images of the white community responding to civil rights activism. So I'll pause here for just a second and ask again, before I give a little bit more context here, what is there about this photograph that speaks to the context of civil rights? How are we as viewers being made or asked to engage with what we see in front of us?
Okay, and while we're waiting for responses there, Andrea writes that Dr. King later said that it was critical to get photos to build support in Middle America. She was also talking earlier about the Children's March and how important it was to get children involved. And then on the photos, Lyon's photo, the one you showed earlier, participant writes, reminiscent of Walker Evans and Dorothy and Lang treating those with simple dignity. Lyons also appears to be highlighting the role of women in the movement. Good point. Could you comment on that, Sara? Do his photos, do they indeed highlight the role of women? Was that a theme in his photography?
So I would say absolutely. Because Lyon was so deeply embedded in all the activities of the movement, he didn't focus quite as much as other civil rights photographers on the heroic male figures. And that was an issue that became, I think, more urgent within the civil rights movement more broadly and within the African American movement in particular over time. The insistence on the kind of iconic male leaders. Lyon was much more interested in the everyday, the kind of, more humble details and the extraordinary courage, the real courage and dignity it took, as in the case of Elizabeth Eckford, to stand up for one's own rights in a context in which that was really difficult to do. And he was interested in women doing that kind of work. And I think this is an image that speaks precisely to that situation. no one has mentioned this yet that I can see in the comments, but at least in this photograph of which he titled "Woman Holds Off a Mob," the woman in the center of the image is the only woman who's readily visible in this entire crowd. This is a major public thoroughfare street in downtown Atlanta. It's a shopping district. We can see restaurants and places of business and commerce, and yet this entire group of people, this crowd of people, seems to be virtually all men. And I think Lyon really has an eye for that. He's constructed the photograph to make that sort of statement.
Right. And one of our participants has noted the reversal here. In the Little Rock photograph, you had angry women. This is another version of the angry white Southerner, but she's angry for different reasons. Andrea Owens writes that you feel right in the middle of the action here. You feel the immediacy. You feel the emotion. Look at the veins in the woman's neck. This woman is amazing standing up to these men. Do we know if this woman was a Southerner or was she a volunteer in from the North? Because one of our participants writes about how this image challenges the image of Southern white femininity.
That is a great question. We actually do know because this woman later spoke to Danny Lyon. She emerged from a store. You can see she has a package of some kind, a box under her arm. She is an Atlantan. She's a native Atlantan. The action that all the other photographers at this moment are photographing is a group of young SNCC students who are protesting segregation in downtown businesses. Instead of photographing that, Lyon has turned his camera onto this moment. This woman was just a shopper downtown. She looked at the young people. She looked at this crowd of men forming on the verge, maybe, of becoming a mob, and she stood up to them. And after this interchange, Lyon wrote later, she went and became part of the protesters. She joined the protesters in their sort of march. So this photograph, the backstory of it is actually quite dramatic. Getting involved in this way, standing up for against a mob. This woman actually sort of changed her own mind, in effect, which I think is really kind of remarkable. Unless we have another question, I'm just thinking maybe we should move on.
Okay, let's move ahead
from there. And I did want to have a chance to linger on this photograph, which is very different from the one we just looked at before. It's also made by Danny Lyon. And I have to say, in the last photograph, I'll go back for just a second. This is another case where Lyon himself is standing with his camera almost in a space that means that he's kind of completing that circle of people around the woman. There's very little distance between his camera and her. He's sort of stepping right up to that event. Lyon is aware that that is not always the appropriate strategy. And there is in his work a kind of remarkable rhythm. There are moments when he does not try to get close to the action. He acknowledges that there is necessarily a distance between his point of view, the point of view of a cameraman, a photographer, very committed to the movement, but a white man from New York who's come south to do movement work. Big distance between that and the perspective, the experience, the sort of stakes in desegregation and civil rights of Black Americans. So without giving any particular context here, I just wanted to ask what sense our participants might make of this image of Lyon's from Birmingham.
Okay, what sense do we make of it? We already have one comment. Interesting that he is on the street while the other photographer is up in a tree. And I think that may be very well a comment on intrusiveness. I mean, that tree is owned presumably by the people who own that house, and presumably it is a Black family that owns it. Okay, what do our participants have to say about this photograph before Sara sets the context for us? Judith Batten is typing in, as other people are. It's interesting that the people are looking squarely on to the camera, particularly the woman holding the child there, sort of in the right side of the picture. Lack of trust shown. There's a great sense of Black solidarity being conveyed in this photo. Yes, very true. There's really that point of solidarity, I think, is well taken. There's really no major point of focus. Your eye maybe goes to the boy standing right there in the front with who's holding with what looks like a helmet, but I don't see any real sight line that takes you to the heart of this photo. So that point about solidarity, group solidarity, is I think well taken. Other comments? How would you respond to that, Sara?
I think that's a great observation. There is no one point of view or unifying perspective, no place that our eyes are directed to go. We cannot take in this image at a glance, if you like. We're sort of forced to make our way through it, to move across it. And I think for most viewers, at least for most white viewers looking at this image, particularly in 1963 when it was produced, this would have produced a certain kind of discomfort. This is an image of a certain kind of confrontation. And maybe here it would be useful to say a little bit about the context. These are members of Birmingham's African American community who have lined up in their own neighborhoods. They're waiting for the funeral procession of the 4 girls, the young girls who were murdered in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing just days before this image is made. So they're mourners. They are coming together with other members of the Black community in solidarity. They're in shock. They are outraged. They are kind of gathering to mourn and to move forward, try to move forward in some way. And I think all the observations we've made about perspective and framing and so on are really apt. This is a moment when Lyon does not feel, he will not go climb up in some family's tree to get a shot of the funeral procession. The real story for him is in that look back at the camera, at him. He's not hidden. He's not concealing himself. He is, in some sense, confronting these Black Americans with a camera. He's clearly letting them know that he's making this image, and he is inviting them, in some sense, to look back at white America, to show or make visible the full depth and intensity of their stakes in this moment and this event, which are not quite the same, of course, as the photographer's own.
Right. Bill Braychak writes, they appear to be waiting. I think we all know what for. That's another good observation about this photo. They are waiting. Indeed, they're waiting for a funeral procession to pass, but they're also waiting for something more.
Absolutely. And they're waiting for change. They're waiting for viewers of this photograph, white Americans in particular, Lyon and everybody he stands for as he makes this image, to respond to a kind of charge here. What kind of America do we believe in? What kind of nation are we making and making up? If we are not in mourning, then what kind of Americans are we? I think is really the sort of larger charge of this image.
And Susan C. makes a good point. She writes, this is one of the first images where the photographer has shown some anger in the photo. And she means there, I'm sure, that African Americans showing anger. We have plenty of anger in Little Rock, but here we see anger on the part of African Americans, particularly the woman holding the child.
Absolutely. And some of the men, we know their eyes are frontal, but they're shaded underneath those hats. It's also, if we really think about context here, in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, these are African American men in the presence of a white man who are not taking off their hats, right? They are not moving. They are not making any gesture of accommodation to him. And that too, I think, is part of the story that the photograph is telling. So that Lyon has chosen to stage that kind of emotional confrontation with himself. I think that's the purpose of this image. That makes it something other than a straightforward news image. The guy in the tree back there with the camera, he's going to get the straightforward news image of the funeral cortege going by. But this image, in some ways, is much more important. And it asks us to think in a very different way, I think.
Yeah. So, Lisa Cater notes the defiance that we see in this picture as well.
Yes, a whole range of emotions here, but the emotions we've named, none of them are the emotions we would associate with victimage. And that, I think, too, is really important. There are moments in the project of civil rights um, uh, and contexts in which photographers really move away from or really try to resist the representation of pacifism is one thing, but it's not the same as passivity. It's not the same as being passive. And I think this is an image that really tries to make that distinction. So I want to move us forward. Unfortunately, we can't linger over all the images. Again, what Lyon does when he makes us confront the resistors, the demonstrators, the strength of their sort of actions. This is another instance, a very famous image of a high school student being arrested very forcefully by the police. I wanted to pause here for just a second. A number of the participants have asked, who saw these images, where did they go? This is just a very, very brief, quick look, just a gesture toward the extraordinary power and range with which civil rights images of the kind we're looking at circulated in national media, increasingly in photojournalism, in daily news outlets, in all kinds of journalistic outlets. It would have been almost impossible to be a reader of any kind of media in the United States during this period from 1962, 1963 on, without on a daily basis being bombarded with images like these. So I think that's very important to the way civil rights photographers begin to reimagine how to create powerful and stirring and meaningful images. And on that note, I want to turn us to the work of Bob Adelman, who again is a very, very respected and often cited photographer. He was another Yankee. He was born in New York City, grew up on Long Island. He actually is often thought of as well as a kind of art photographer. He studied photography with the legendary Alexei Brodovich, who was the art director for Harper's Bazaar, who worked with photographers like Martin Munkachi and Richard Avedon. We see that training, I think, reflected in the work that Adelman does on civil rights and social inequality. This extraordinary sense of drama and beauty that is combined with his commitment to thinking about social change. This is one of his most iconic images, and it was made in Louisiana in 1964. And again, before I give anything in the way of context, I'd really be interested to hear what participants think of this, how this might speak to us as a civil rights image.
Okay, how does this one speak to us as a civil rights image? You really can't tell if there's a black man standing on the porch. I mean, he's in shadow, so we can't tell what race. Before we get to that, Alice Garrett writes that these images we've seen have spread all overseas and led to outrage toward the failure of the United States to take action. That is true. Judith Batten suggests that this is an image of someone anticipating trouble, preparing for a fight if necessary, surrounded by darkness, quite symbolic. Any other comments? That's a wooden house, looks like a cabin. So it's electrically lit, so we know it's a modern cabin, and that there's a modern screen door, and those look like modern windows. So this isn't the frontier, but it certainly echoes the frontier, I think.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. So if I can get us started here, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. This is an image made of the Reverend Joe Carter, who is standing guard in front of his own home the night after he registered to vote. He was the first African American in his town, West Feliciana Parish, actually, the first African American to register from that all-black parish in 61 years since Reconstruction. And he understands that it is highly likely that the KKK or other local groups resisting the right of African Americans to vote will turn up at his house. So again, this isn't a straightforward news image or journalistic image. It really is this extraordinary study in dark and light, and an image that mobilizes our sort of symbolic, our response to the symbolic dimensions of dark and light. You've pointed out, Richard, that we can't see his face. And there he is, an American with a rifle, defending his home, defending his right to be an American, to be a citizen, to settle and make a life, invoking the kind of deepest myths and ideals and ideologies of American settlement and what it means to grow our country. So I think this is a really powerful image. The symbolism it evokes is really very obvious, and yet it works very powerfully nonetheless.
Zach Lechner, and I hope I pronounced the last name properly there, has a very good point. Seems like it's taken from the perspective of a would-be assassin, suggesting the danger and loneliness of a black man asserting his rights in the Jim Crow South. Yes, this image of bravery. I mean, he's a target. Silhouetted like that, he's a target.
And as one of the participants points out, this is an African American man holding a gun, and he will not be passive in the face of threats to his family, to his home, to his person. This is a very dignified image. It's an image of real dignity and self-assertion, but this is an American who is invoking his right to bear arms. He will not strike first, but he will defend himself.
Powerful photo. Shall we move ahead?
So we will move ahead. We can't leave Bob Adelman without taking a quick look at this image. Now, we spent quite a bit of time on that earlier Charles Moore image of the Bull Connor and the police and firefighters using the fire hoses on demonstrators in Birmingham. I wanted to show this alternative image by Bob Adelman, which is very different in feeling. So again, the question, how does this function as a civil rights image? How are we as viewers of this image brought into the drama, the violence, the sort of historical power of this moment?
Yeah, how are we brought into the historical power of this moment? It's so hard to name the most powerful image in this presentation, but I would certainly have to nominate this one. Really,
that's a good choice.
Yeah, I mean, we know that the water is coming in from the right, but it could that water on the right could also be the spray of a wave crashing over these people. We say, wow, reminiscent of a biblical flood, though God isn't part of this deluge. Very good insight, I think. And the sky is not really the sky. It looks like it might be foliage, that darkness in the top of the photo, but it certainly does look like a stormy sky.
It does indeed. I mean, I think one of the things that Adelman has done here, and this is where his extraordinary expertise as a photographer comes into play. He's worked with the values of light and dark here in a way to kind of screen out what we might think of as photojournalistic detail. We really see the force of that water, which is so powerful and so dynamic in its movement that it almost becomes allegorical. It is biblical. This is epic imagery. And the one thing that we might not notice on, without a lot more inspection of the photograph than we probably have time to make here, is that the protesters here are standing. They can sustain their posture against the force of this water only because they're gripping on to one another. It was only by holding on to one another that they avoided being, completely bowled over. And I think again, the sort of symbolic dimension there, the faith in collective care, in sort of making this resistance together, there's a real spiritual dimension to this photograph. God may be absent from the flood, but there's something very spiritual about the way those protesters are counting on and leaning on and supporting one another. I think at least that's the intention of the photograph.
You and Andrea Owens think alike. She said that this photograph is force personified. Some other comments here. Kelly Ingram Park, where this was taken, is an interesting place to visit. This could be a Cold War picture because the Soviet Union published criticisms of the movement. Be interesting to explore that comment. More beautiful than any painting, epic imagery, well said. Judith Batten writes, the ominous sky is similar to that seen in the photo on the bridge. Their eyes were watching God. This evokes that novel to Lisa Cater. And storm clouds raging. Yeah, this is a hugely powerful image. I think it would work well with students. I think you can get a lot of discussion around this in a class.
And I will say that students often, when I've worked on this photograph with students, they're often really interested in the question of how an image this beautiful can speak to the violence of civil rights. What does it mean that the photographer has really chosen to magnify and amplify not just the dramatic qualities here, but to make this photograph sort of exceedingly beautiful.
Hmm.
So I think it raises in a really interesting way the question, what role does beauty play, or a kind of formal attention to the formal qualities of an image? Can that actually work toward consciousness raising, or movement of the sort of political responses of viewers, rather than undercut it in some way?
Hmm. Sarah,
So
was this picture published journalistically?
this image was widely published. Adelman was on various kinds of journalistic assignment. He published in Life, he published in Look, he published in various newspapers. This one, actually, interestingly, to speak to the questions we were just raising, not only circulated photojournalistically, it was also exhibited in a kind of museum, a series of museum contexts, not long after it was made. Was one of the earliest of these civil rights images to be recognized as a kind of art form. So again,
Hmm.
that movement back and forth between art and news or journalism, between a historical record and a call to viewers to really activate the imagination and to be engaged in a more profound way.
Okay, one final comment on this before we move on. I think the beauty draws the viewer in and does not initially offend, but the message is still strongly communicated by the photographer. So your point that here Adelman has used beauty in the service of a social message.
Right, and
Okay, so
yeah, let me go on ahead. And again, we could spend a lot more time with Bob Adelman. I just point out for participants who might want to come back to some of these images, how what a gift he has for sort of choosing a single individual in a crowd and thinking about the confrontation between that individual and, others in the crowd, to not to reduce this whole set of very turbulent and dynamic events to something on the individual level, but to allow us to see it on that level, the force that these experiences had in everyday life. Now, I said we'd look at color, so I do want to pause for just a minute or two on Bob Adelman's photograph of the Reverend Martin Luther King during the Selma to Montgomery March, which I'm guessing many of you as teachers will be very interested to focus on, since many of your students will have seen the recent film version. And I just want to ask, what difference does the use of color here make? Adelman made a number of portraits, beautiful portraits of King, over the course of his embeddedness in the movement. Many of them were in black and white. This one he deliberately chose to make in color during that kind of epic moment of the Montgomery March.
okay, what difference does color make in this? I have to confess, what didn't strike me about this photograph, I wasn't struck so much by the color. I was struck by the tight close-up and the cropping. I mean, we don't see, it's not a full headshot. It's just focused squarely on eyes, nose, mouth, and eyebrows. That's what struck me most about this image, as opposed to the fact that it isn't color. However, one of our participants writes, there is a warmth to the image that would be missing in black and white. Yes, indeed, that is quite true.
Mhm.
We've got some more folks typing in. He looks young, vital, and intense. I think the color might make the photograph more contemporary for students. They see black and white so much older and less related to their lives.
True. I'm sure that's true.
Andrea writes, it humanizes, flesh and blood, not iconic. You can see the wheels turning, a master strategist. The eyes tell the story. That is vivid. Color makes it feel more recent and perhaps more relevant to students learning about Selma today. There's that point again about contemporary students in color photography. I think those are all really good comments, and I do think that the color humanizes it here. It does take it out of the realm of that black and white journalistic photography and puts it in the realm of portraiture.
Mm-hmm. And it also, this is, as a number of the participants were suggesting, this is a it's not an undignified image, but it is not merely heroic. I mean, we see the sweat, we see the pores of his face, we see, this is very, very up close. And yet, I think we still have the sense of layers upon layers upon layers. This is not a man who is easy to know. And at some level, I guess I want to argue Adelman has done something kind of brilliant here. He's given us this incredibly intense and compelling portrait of someone up really close and personal, and yet he's managed to suggest how difficult it, not only how difficult it would be to be Martin Luther King, but how difficult it is to know him, that the public figure is not the whole story, and that there's deep complexity here that we can respect without necessarily knowing in any easy way.
I think the participant who noticed the eyes really caught something, because you will notice those eyes are not looking at the camera, at the photographer. They're looking off to the right. That is a calculating glance. He clearly, you get the sense that he is thinking about something here, and it's not the photographer.
That is right. That is exactly right. And he may or may not be aware of the photographer. All of that I think is really helpful. And these would be helpful kinds of questions to raise with students as well. It is, I think, in essence, a defamiliarizing image. Of course, we recognize King, this, hugely iconic figure, but he doesn't look here the way he looks in all those other images. And I think that's kind of important, is to get us to see new. So, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
It kind of rescues him from the heroic and rescues him from being purely inspirational. And it does bring out the human and the, as one of our participants said, the strategist here.
Yeah,
this is a political man.
A lovely way to put it. I do want to move ahead, if that's okay. I'm sorry we don't have more time. I wanted to be sure that we had a chance to talk about this image made by the photographer Bruce Davidson, who, again, although his work was widely published in journalistic outlets, news magazines mostly, is really known as an art photographer, a kind of art documentarian. He was very committed to making images of civil rights activity. He himself participated in the movement as a relatively young person. And here he was in the Selma campaign for voting rights in 1965. Again, I don't need to give a lot of context here. I want to ask what participants think of this image, and in particular, what they think their students might make of this particular photograph.
Well, Lisa has gotten to the heart of the matter. I really don't understand the white paint. So let's put that question out there for other folks. Why the white paint? That's, the flag is dramatic. The look on the young boy on the right is dramatic, but right there, squarely in the foreground, looking right at the camera, the young man with the white paint, the white face. A comment on blackface? Definitely, I would think. Hey, what else? It's makeup. What can we make of that? Perhaps harkens back to, I don't know, African tribal markings? I don't know. Lots of things going on here. We've got multiple attendees typing. My students always point out the white paint. They have often remarked that only someone with a white face can vote. Smart students. The idea is going to pop out at people. If you're white, you vote. A comment on the end of white America. Sara, I think we got some good responses here.
We have some great responses, and I love that they take us in slightly different directions. I think all of these are, kind of available meanings that would be great to talk about. So the repetition, ironically, or as a political sort of strategy, of minstrelsy, of blackface, now it's whiteface, the commentary on the denial of voting rights to Black Americans, only those who look white get to vote, the use of the Black body as a kind of stage to act out the deep necessity for change, right? The makeup and the making up. There's something about that whiteface, that paint, that makeup, and the flag in connection with one another, visually, that my students often comment on. That's a huge oversized flag. The stars that pop out at you, the makeup on the face. Also vote. The message isn't, freedom or change, or the message is vote. And there's a double message there too, as a number of participants have written, if this young man were white, he could vote. But I think there's also an invitation there. There's a very challenging look, or couple of looks, but there's also an invitation to white Americans. They have a vote, they have political power, they can use that power for change. So the claim on voting, on full citizenship, on the stakes of belonging to America for Black Americans like themselves, these young men, but also the recognition that, you know, white Americans have a kind of power to vote that they too can use. So the question I really wanted to ask for participants is, do they think this is an image of confrontation or an image that invites viewers somehow to join in this project, given everything we've seen so far about the back and forth and the way that gazes work in these civil rights images?
Okay, good question. Is it an invitation to join, or is it defiant? Well, Brent Tomberlin says join. Alice says defiance and sadness.
Mm-hmm.
So
It could be both.
two directions here at once. The boys' men appear to be mocking white America. Yes, yes, the white face certainly does. Not confrontation, education. Well put, Judith. Education. Yeah.
So we could say a lot more about this photograph. I'll just make one quick note, and if any of the participants want to chime in, that's great. This too is a moment where the photographer, Davidson, has had to step out from the action in order to get an image like this. He's kind of gotten up close in the faces of these young men whom he doesn't know and invited them to look at him and his camera as a way of looking at the people who will ultimately see this image. So although we can't see the photographer here, I mean, one question I often work on with my students is, you know, what difference does it make that there was a photographer standing in that place making that image? To what degree is that photographer a surrogate for us as viewers, or for white America, or for America more broadly? And this image, I think, is one that would really bear some discussion along those lines. Who's being looked at in what kind of way? Unfortunately, we probably have to move on from this. I'm, again, just mindful of the time, but grateful for the good discussion. This image I included another sort of moment where Bruce Davidson has his camera take a very challenging kind of posture, right, joining the police who are literally dragging this protester away. So that's something that we could sort of look at. I wanted to have a brief conversation. One thing we haven't talked about yet, we've talked about the positioning of photographers embedded in the movement, joining civil rights activities, strategically stepping back, or even promoting a kind of confrontation, allowing for a kind of confrontation on the part of protesters, particularly African-American protesters and resistors, with the camera. That I think inevitably raises an important question about whether at any point in the movement, the work of African-American photographers has a different aim, or operates in any sort of different way, or produces any kind of different effects. I think that's a very complicated question, but I did want to address it briefly by looking at least a couple of images. And the first of them is this image. I'm pretty sure everyone involved in this conversation has seen it before. I think if you've ever, studied in an American public school, or just, spent time thinking at all about American history, you probably would have seen this. This, of course, is an image of Coretta Scott King with her daughter Bernice at the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968. And I noticed that people are, talking about the focus on the young girl, the sadness in her eyes, the dignity of Coretta Scott King. I think it is pretty fair and safe to say that this image could not have been made except by a photographer who really was part of this community of mourners, who was integrally part of the community, and really the African-American community, the community of worshipers who were attending this funeral service, this celebration. The closeness, the intimacy, the kind of tenderness of this photograph, I think all of this is really about the way in which Sleet himself was connected here to this world and embedded in it. And I should say that for this image, Minetta Sleet won the first Pulitzer Prize for photojournalism ever given to an African American. So this too became iconic, although perhaps would never have come into being had it been intended as a merely journalistic kind of image.
Mm-hmm.
And one more along the same lines, an image made by the extraordinary photographer Roy de Carava. De Carava was a native of Harlem. He was deeply committed to civil rights activism, both in the North and at certain points in his life in the U.S. South. De Carava was never known as a photojournalistic photographer, although his work did occasionally appear, as this one did. This image appeared on the cover of Newsweek in 1963. But he's really known as an art photographer, a documentarian who made these profoundly beautiful, composed images of Black life and Black culture in the 1960s and 70s. And again, I wanted to sort of pause for just a second and ask our viewers how they might understand this as a civil rights image. What is there about the view of this very beautiful young woman, these two young people, that de Carava offers us that would speak to the urgencies of addressing social inequality or attending to the need to create more civil rights?
Mm-hmm. Laura writes, the young lady looks determined. Brent writes, she's focused. She does not seem intimidated. Doesn't know about her future, but she won't stop. Alice Garrett notes, Ginger Park, she is stoic, looks like a soldier. This is a remarkable photo. There's a painterly, almost sculptural quality to this. And then, of course, in the background, that looks like the American flag. A beautiful depth of field, shows layers of people it affects. Yeah, it does suggest a crowd. It does suggest a crowd moving ahead because of that image there of the young man on the out of focus image of the young man on the right foreground. Yeah, very powerful. And of course, dropped into the context of 1963, this resonates profoundly, particularly on the cover of a national news magazine. I'd love to know what she was thinking. Yes. Well, I think we all would.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of the invitation here in a way that photojournalism may do this, art certainly does it, to try to imagine what this young woman is thinking and feeling and aspiring to. I will just say that these are Mississippi Freedom Marchers. They're very young. They're essentially wearing school uniforms, white shirts and sort of dark trousers. I think she has on a dress, kind of a standard issue uniform. And so that feeling of solidarity, of uniformity, the extraordinary way that de Carava has of suggesting both her intense individuality and also this sense of a collective or a crowd that we've picked up on, all in this very tightly framed photograph where we really only see three or parts of three people. And yet that sense of a movement behind her and beside her and around her, I think, is very palpable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this would make an excellent instructional resource for our teachers. Wonderful photo. Yeah. So, shall we move ahead?
I'm going to move ahead. I won't talk about de Carava's five men. I'll invite the viewers to go back maybe on their own time and try to figure out where all the five men are. I will just say, this is an image of mourners in a Harlem church after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. So this is a very somber sort of funeral service. And again, de Carava is focusing not on the deaths or the violence themselves, but on the power of this response, the kind of spiritual power, the kind of political power of this response of Black Americans gathering together and looking to move ahead together. I wanted to end with an image that I think one of the other participants has already referenced it. If we had to pick one image to stand for the project of visualizing the struggle, the affirmative utopian struggle for civil rights and social equality at this moment, I think many people would choose this one by James Corrales, made in 1965. Again, part of the now, I hope, for our students, again, newly familiar Selma to Montgomery March, that whole historical context, great film that's, kind of brought it back to life in a new way. This really is a remarkable image. And I guess I just want to ask participants to comment on how it might serve as an icon for the history of civil rights at this time, or a metaphor, maybe one of the participants has suggested.
How is it a metaphor for civil rights at this time? 1965, Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights. This is an enormously powerful picture. I mean, that line seems almost endless, that it takes you back. It seems to be that, there are more and more people coming from where they came from. Andrea Owens notes a gathering storm. Ginger Park writes, I cannot wait to use these photos, so powerful. The sky in this image helps to encompass. And I lost the rest of it. The chat is going by so fast. See, there's victory even in the midst of storm clouds. No matter what tries to deter them, they will march on. Definitely the storm clouds suggest the storm of the march. I love that Corrales stepped off the road, and his camera is looking up. Storms are brewing, leaning back in defiance. Some thought on biblical, this raises biblical allusions in Bertha's mind, and the light is guiding the people. There's also a sense here that while they're in the storm may be passing. I mean, it's that those clouds are definitely moving. Those first three marchers there in the white shirts with their straight backs and their steps in sync, that sets the tone, I think, for the entire line of march. Except this is not an exodus. It's full of exodus imagery. Yes,
indeed. It is indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I will notice one quick technical detail that might not be obvious to people. Corrales has done something very distinctive here from a photographic point of view. He has chosen not to correct for what technically would be known as parallax, that curving of the image at the edge of the lens there, which really gives those three marchers in front this incredible sense, an exaggerated sense of both uniformity and motion stepping ahead into the future, the kind of angle at which they're stepping off. And it also makes the clouds up ahead that are, they're moving really fast. It kind of gives them a curve and a shape. So there's a temporal dimension to this image, even though it's a static image, it's a still image. There really is this extraordinary sense of movement here.
The power of faith, power of movement, getting to the promised land. The storm is passing over, which is an African American spiritual. So there's another allusion here in the photo. Let's see. God guided his people from the promised land with a cloud by day. Yet another biblical allusion. Boy, this speaks on all sorts of different levels.
It does, and I love that the participants are invoking textual context, biblical context of song and African American spirituals, which would have been very present to the folks involved in the movement, would have been part of the soundscape of the civil rights movement. And photographers don't, with still images at any rate, don't have sound or text in quite that way. But I really think that's absolutely right. They're drawing on all of that and making it part of the sort of rhetoric, the invitation to the viewer, the power of what we see.
Well, shall we move on? I think we've got one more image to...
do we have time to look at one more?
Yes. Oh, yes. I don't think anybody's going to leave.
Okay, well, I'll go very quickly to Steve Shapiro's image made in 1968. We've just seen, and here I'm extending beyond the boundaries of what's often called the shorter civil rights movement, through the 1950s. There is this critical moment, the moment of assassination, the moment of fracture and division about the strategy of pacifism within the movement. By 1968, of course, the landscape for the struggle for civil rights looks very different. I don't necessarily want to end on a kind of down note, but in counterpoint with the image, the Corrales image we just saw, might be useful to look at Steve Shapiro's photograph. This is not, again, a standard photojournalistic image. He had been out, every other photographer in, on assignment has been making images of the motel room, of the motel, of the bloody balcony, of the police activity around the assassination of Martin Luther King. And Shapiro was really seeking some way to visualize the sense of emptiness and loss that he felt and that he understood many Americans would feel. And this image was his way of doing that, was to turn his camera on the place where King had spent the last, kind of moments of his life inside this hotel room, and to look at the very humble objects that spoke to the work, the really hard labor that King did, speaking and testifying and preaching and resisting and leading and so on. And I don't necessarily, again, want to end in a negative way, but I think this image is remarkable to me for sort of suggesting to us how imaginatively engaged these photographers were and how hard they worked to try to find ways to visualize what the histories and the legacies of racial inequality meant, what the work of all Americans who resisted those legacies looked like, and trying to provide us images around which we might actually actively engage and seek to create change imaginatively, politically, socially, in whatever way we feel called to do. So one of the participants points out that the irony of the fact that King himself, of course, is dead. He's been murdered. His body has been removed, and we have an image of him up on the television screen. So that confrontation or that dialogue between the camera and the TV screen, right? The role that the media is playing in unfolding this whole sort of incredibly dramatic event.
Right, and I think this photograph takes us back to one of the critical questions you posed at the beginning of the webinar. What is missing from this photograph? And of course, what's missing is the live Martin Luther King. One of our participants points out that it is ironic that the folded newspaper in the suitcase, the headline reads "Soul Force," and then I think if you look up, move to the right, and you see the folded magazine in the pocket of the suitcase, I believe that says "Strength Today." In the headline.
It does indeed. And so again, the photographer did not stage this, right? The power of photography to take what we find in the world and to allow us to connect with it on this deeper, sometimes mythic, sometimes symbolic, but this deeper level. Why the headline should say "Soul Force," really have no idea, but there it is. And there is strength today. And there on that table below the TV across from the suitcase are the cigarette butts and the coffee cups and so the power here of those suddenly newly inspirational and symbolic messages with the evidence of this deeply human lived life, I think, is part of the force of the image.
Yeah, Laura writes, I think it shows finality. For me, this is a photo of both presence and absence. Yeah.
And again, I hate to end here. Are there any other comments that we should take? I was just going to do one last quick.
Well, we've got Lisa Cater writes here, "Rising from the Dead," really neat. This does have a quality of the empty tomb quality, Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb on Easter morning and the body's not there, yet the presence is.
That's lovely.
I don't know.
And with everything that implies about resurrection, redemption, and afterlife. And maybe one way, I really love that suggestion, that one way to read this image, which after all, is an image of an image, right? It's an image of a television screen on which there is an image, a kind of ghostly image. Again, an invitation. How will that redemption be accomplished? How will that afterlife unfold? If King himself is gone, what will be the afterlife of, the work he's done and the promise he's left behind?
Hmm. And Bill Braychek notes that there is a foreboding shown here too, which is, I think, a very insightful comment. So you have one more for us, Sarah?
Well, I don't have another image. Well, I do actually have another, just a quick montage here. I just wanted to suggest that after 1968, 68, 69, the power of the camera, the staging of confrontation, of resistance, begins to take on new lives, new dimensions as the Black Panther Party, as the Black Power movement unfold, and as the use of photojournalistic cameras and the presence of the press becomes motivated in new and different ways. And that would be the subject of a whole, another seminar that I just wanted to put out there, that the longer arc of this legacy of photojournalism and civil rights imaging we've been looking at would not come to rest, in the 1960s or even in the 1970s. It really would lead forward toward the events of our own moment. And one question I might really want to ask students the next time I work with these materials is, where are the iconic images of Ferguson or of Baltimore? Do we have civil rights images or images of resistance to inequality in our own moment that draw on the legacy that we're seeing here? And that, of course, is very much an open-ended question. For participants who might be interested in thinking about it, I've included one last slide, again, just to view at your leisure, to think about some additional resources that that might help round out the kind of teaching and thinking and imagining we can do working with this body of photographs.
Mm-hmm. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we will put these this list of resources on the seminar forum. We'll post that tomorrow so that you'll have them. But of course, they will be available to you in the recording of this presentation, which will be available on the website. And in response to your question about where will the iconic images come from, Andrea writes, with smartphones, everyone is a participant observer today, and that opens up a whole different set of questions, which indeed would be the subject of another seminar. You realize, of course, Sarah, you just volunteered to do another seminar. You realize
I would be delighted. It would be a great pleasure. And I have to say, the participants tonight have been fantastic. It's really been great working with you.
Well, I thank you. I have moderated over, I don't know, close to 200 of these, and this one has been superb. You led us through some really powerful material wonderfully tonight. Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, and I think you've given our teachers a great deal to use with their students. Thank you.
My great pleasure. Good night, everybody.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please don't forget your evaluations, and please check our final seminar of the season. Sarah earlier mentioned that these images don't come with a soundscape. Well, we're going to give you the soundscape, or at least one soundscape, of the civil rights movement tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. We're going to be looking at civil rights and rhythm and blues. And that will be our final seminar for this season. Please, we will check our americainclass.org webinars. We will have our new schedule up sometime by the middle of June, and we hope you will join us again in the future. Thank all of you for your really enthusiastic and intelligent participation this evening. Hope we'll see you back again tomorrow night. So let me just say now, thank you and good evening.